If you were around in the 70s and had even the slightest bit of interest in sports, you may remember that very well-known line spanning the globe to bring you the constant variety of sport, the thrill of victory, and the agony of defeat. We can all maybe see that in our minds, especially if that sounds at all familiar to you. If you saw the show, you remember the victory, the celebration part, and then you remember that skier coming downhill and crashing as he went over the jump. The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, because I think of that show, have been ever entwined, and one kind of often goes with the other. This idea of victory, but also this idea of loss and tragedy. So thinking about that got me thinking about Holy Week, and it got me to thinking about that experience, that roller coaster experience of the thrill of victory as well as the agony of defeat that must have been a part of that first Holy Week experience, even before it was called Holy Week. If you're familiar with the story, it starts with Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is that victory moment. Jesus has been traveling, has been making his way towards Jerusalem. They come into Jerusalem, him riding on the back of a donkey, and everyone coming out and celebrating with palm branches and shouting, Hosanna to the King. And it's this moment of great victory. Even though Jesus has been telling his disciples all along that there is going to be an imminent thing that's going to happen with his arrest and his death, they've kind of rejected that. They've forgotten about that almost. And yet, for Jesus, this moment just seems like to those disciples this time of victory. But we know, those of us who know the story, know what's going to happen on Friday. And on Good Friday, there's going to be that moment of the feeling of defeat when Jesus is crucified. That's a roller coaster experience where victory and agony have been brought together once again, this time in that moment of Holy Week. And there's that turning point for the disciples, that turning point when they're beginning to see that perhaps all those things that Jesus had talked about are really going to take place. In Matthew chapter 26, and this is told in the other Gospels as well, we hear the story of what's going to be happening. For us, it's the story of the Last Supper. But for them, it was the story of the celebration of Passover. So this is what happens, Matthew 26, verse 17. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat Passover?" Jesus said, Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I will keep Passover at your house with my disciples. So the disciples did as Jesus directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. You see, for them, that's all they were doing, preparing the Passover meal, that time where they are going to be able to celebrate the victory that was the release from slavery in Egypt. That's what this Passover meal was remembering. And yet, in the midst of that meal, the mood rapidly changes. There they were in the midst of having this Passover meal and remembering God's victory and God's rescue for them. And Jesus says this, when it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. The thrill of victory that was Palm Sunday for us, that time of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, quickly changes to that time of defeat. Now you and I know what comes after this. We know that there is an even greater victory that's going to take place when Jesus is raised from the tomb and death cannot hold him anymore. You and I know that that ultimate victory is still coming. But not the disciples. Not the disciples. They were on that roller coaster, and it was so confusing to them. And that's why I think in some ways Easter was just so overwhelming. They did not know what to do. You know, perhaps that's part of our problem when it comes to celebration of Holy Week. I mean, we oftentimes gather on Sunday mornings, and if we're not at a Maundy, Thursday service or a Good Friday service, we just go right into Easter, celebration after celebration. And we don't really understand the power that is the great victory of Easter unless we understand what was the agony of defeat of Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. So perhaps this year, maybe this year, you can find a way to pause during those days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, to make yourself ready for the message of that great victory that is the empty tomb. It's a journey that's difficult, I guess, sometimes for us to take. But perhaps it's the journey that disciples really need to take in order to understand what is the hope that God gives us on Easter Sunday.